Like I said before the break, in the morning we heard a lot from customers about the challenges and some of the battle scars that they have seen as they have started to adopt SDN architectures. What we have coming up next is a panel of technologists who are really driving the bleeding edge of innovation as it comes to SDN. Our next panel will discuss various architectural approaches to SDN. Please join me in welcoming Matt Palmer and our panelists from Big Switch, Cisco, and Juniper Networks. Matt, who is the moderator of the panel, will introduce the speakers later. Matt is a partner at Wiretap Ventures and co-curator of the website SDNCentral, which is quickly becoming the go-to website for anything and everything related to SDN. So my pleasure to invite Matt and the rest of the team up here.
All right, thank you everyone. Thank you for joining us. And we're gonna have a fairly rapid panel with 30 minutes today. I'd like to quickly introduce our panelists. We have Kireeti Kompella from Juniper Networks, Rob Sherwood from Big Switch, and Omar Sultan from Cisco. And maybe just before we dive into the panel, I just want to share a couple of observations that I've had from this morning, and I think to maybe set the context for the panel itself, which is, we're going to talk a little bit about today the architectures and the customer and sort of the customer use cases and what's driving those architectures from a vendor perspective. And one of the things that we see on SDNCentral is that where people are really deploying SDN are places where they have an absolute need. And where we're seeing that need being delivered or being needed is being driven by three things. One is cloud computing and virtualization is creating an order of magnitude increase in the number of server devices. We see mobility driving an order of magnitude increase in the number of mobile devices. And we're seeing social networking and the related applications driving an order of magnitude of the number of connections that people have to connect. All of which is driving an order of magnitude increase into the demands on the network, which is what's really driving the need for new approaches to actually do networking today. So with that, I'm going to ask each panelist to give us their view of a brief definition of SDN. Less than 2 minutes, guys. If I need to, I will need to cut you off. And then ask really what customer segments and use cases from their perspectives as a vendor are they focused on, and where do they see the biggest opportunity, both from a startup perspective but also within their own organizations. Kireeti?
Thanks, Matt. So I refuse to be constrained by these three letters, SDN. So I'm just going to tell you what the movement SDN is. And I think we've heard this earlier today. People want more control of their network, but they want more automation. And there was the use of the word static. Yeah, there's a lot of static stuff going on in the network. So we have to pull back from that. We have to be able to control the network. I think the important thing there is it has to be a level of abstraction that we don't have today. The control and data plane separation that everyone talks about, I think the most important thing is to separate ourselves from the boxes. And that's more in our head than actually in the network, but then it has to translate to something in the network. So at the end of the day, SDN is about more control of the network in a more abstract way, in a way that's decoupled from the boxes and gives you the agility, the scale. And then you asked what aspect of networking, and the answer is yes.
Thank you, Rob.
So I'm going to say roughly the same thing in what I think of as a different way. I'm kind of a programmer by training, and so if you think of what are the tenets of good software design, you hear things like there's modularity, there's well-defined APIs, and there's loose coupling. And if you look at what's going on in the network, we have none of those things right now. And so when I think of a software-defined networking, I really think of these tenets of good software design, bringing them into the architecture and the network architecture. So if you think about separation of control of data plane, I say loose coupling and modularity. And it turns out from there you need an API in between. And so I think we're all saying the same things, but where the confusion comes is software is software, and we should make the network look a little bit more like that. And I will firmly agree with the previous speaker about what part of the network. The answer is yes.
So same thing. I think we look at SDN, really the broader concept is around programmable infrastructure, being able to open up and decouple control plane from the infrastructure, both kind of from a two-way conversation, being able to have applications and policy control how infrastructure is behaving. At the same time, also being able to take a look at what's going on in the infrastructure and having applications and the like be able to take advantage of that. And I think there are a number of ways of accomplishing that. In terms of where, again, I think we're unanimous everywhere. I think this is one of those things that's going to be a horizontal technology across different verticals and different market segments. I think the thing to bear in mind is it's going to look very different, though. I think what solves problems for a service provider is going to look very different than what solves problems for a mid-market company.
Great, thanks, gentlemen. So now we're going to ask a number of questions to the panelists, and feel free to jump in with your answers if you disagree, or even if you agree, but have something to add.
See, Rob's got the redundant microphones, I see. So
yeah, he's got full backup mode. Yeah. Yeah, we should have got everyone up for shocking, but we didn't do that today. Omar, why don't we start with you on this one, which is one of the things that we hear on SDNCentral quite frequently is really around what are the barriers to adoption of SDN technologies, primarily from a technology perspective to start with, and then what as vendors and technologists can we do to remove those barriers, and how does that relate to the startup world, so that not just the customers to solve that, but what do startups have to think about in the audience as they think about deploying or developing SDN solutions?
Okay, so I think three things at least leap to mind with that. The one you're probably not expecting is the wetware side of things in terms of how people think and how organizations are set up. And we're doing with SDN some wildly crazy things around how networks are run, how applications are run, those sorts of things. And a lot of times organizations are not just set up to take maximum advantage of that. And we saw this with virtualization in cloud, where there are cool technology concepts, but often organizations are not set up in a way that can really take advantage of that. I think the second piece is, with any new and emerging technology, there is a challenge around, there's some perceived risk with a particular vendor, particular technology, a particular architecture. With that, I think Open Daylight, which we've all bought in on, really helps on that front in terms of it helps do some risk mitigation for the both for vendors as well as for customers. I think the final piece is just skill sets. At some point you probably want some merging of our skill sets to exist in a business to be able to take full advantage of what SDN can offer.
So, surprising to at least myself, I will hardly agree with almost everything Omar said. I'm very fortunate in my job. I get to talk to a lot of customers, and the biggest friction point for deploying SDN is the wetware, the culture gap, the skill set gap. It's not even necessarily that it's harder, that it's just different. You can't go into the bookstore and find a book on what are the best practices for deploying SDN. And I think these things are not at all technological. I think it's just a matter of it's a new technology. It's going to take people a little bit of time to wrap their minds around things. And everyone who does has been very successful about it and very happy about it. But it is a cultural shift. The number of network people who I've talked to who are trying to learn Python now, it's definitely on the rise.
So I'll agree, but in a slightly different way. I talked to somebody about SDN and automation and the ability to do more with less, and they said, "You mean with less people, right?" And that was a huge thing. I mean, there is that aspect of SDN that if you bring in automation, if you bring in all these new tools, do we need all the people that we have today? The second thing is the change. I think Rob referred to this. The change in the kind of technology that you want. So here I am. I know OSPF. I know BGP. I know networking. And then you suddenly tell me no, but it's about something else. Like, okay, what happens to OSPF and BGP? Well, the way we use it, we still have OSPF and BGP, but it's under the covers. And what you do is this higher level programming, which is not Python, but it's this new high-level language that expresses things. So from a technology point of view, because you said technology, right? But yep. Most of us actually have talked more about the soft stuff, the wet stuff. The technology point of view, I think there are two things. One is we don't understand what the standards here should be. And we all talk about APIs, but I don't really believe in APIs. I think of protocols as an API to distance. And so APIs incorporate in them the semantics, and protocols do. APIs don't always. So APIs say, here are the parameters, but what they mean, you have to go read the man pages. Whereas in protocols, you have to be very clear what the specification is, what the semantics is. So I think the technology parts are the standards behind SDN. And the second thing is, if you really want to go to this higher level language, what is the right data model for expressing what you want to express? And a lot of that is really understanding what you want to do in a network and then be able to express that in the right way. So I think that's the kind of thing that SDN should be tackling, and today, right now, isn't.
So one quick follow-on to that, which is, now how do we as vendors or as an industry take all of that to simplify this so that we can lower the barriers to adoption?
It's a hard question.
That's why I asked you.
Thanks.
I can jump in there if you want.
Go ahead.
So I mean, I think there's a bunch of very kind of small tactical things that you can do. So if you look at some of the products we develop, there's a very standard looking CLI, but if you enable a certain debugging mode, it will tell you the backend API's calls it's making. So if you're used to a CLI world and you're interested in learning more about the API world, this is a nice little tactical learning tool that will help you transfer through this. And I think there's a bunch of kind of low hanging fruit in that world to help that.
Oh, that's very cool.
One quick thing I want to follow up on what Kireeti said about having fewer people. Every networking shop that I know has huge back pressure on them of things that they want to do. And I have not met one customer who's deployed this who have net less network operators. They now actually, in a lot of cases, have more because they get more bang for the buck out of their employees. So that's something where I think
and I would agree. Actually, if you go back to what Sergio said in an earlier discussion, he said, for him, SDN is about revenue rather than cost savings or OPEX savings. And if you turn that around a different way, if SDN makes you more efficient, then you take the same number of people you have today, but you get more done. And that more done turns into more revenue.
And I think we actually have history with that. I mean, we've looked at other transitions, whether it's voice over IP or storage or a couple of these other things. And, there's always this fear, we're going to, we're not going to have voice people anymore. We're not going to have storage people anymore. And what really happens is, no, you probably still have the same people, but they get to move up the stack and do more valuable things than spending half their day doing moves, adds, changes. I mean, take kind of the low-level stuff and get the infrastructure smart enough to handle that. You actually get the people that you're probably paying a lot of money for to actually be able to do cooler, more value-producing things that are more directly tied to your bottom line. And I think, at least, this initial wave of SDN adoption is totally about being able to do those kinds of things in the network.
So I want to come back to the question, which is, sorry.
Hey, we don't need you, man. We'll just
Yeah, it's all right. You sound like my wife at home.
Which is, how do we get better adoption and how do we solve these hard problems? For me, the hardest problem is what's the right abstraction for a network? And I think we've been so focused on the southbound and we're looking at what's the right machine language for the network. And we really have to ask what's the right abstraction, what's a high level language for the network. And that's why I say it's a hard question.
Great, thank you. So moving on to the next question, which was, so all three of these companies are founding members of Open Daylight. And just as a quick ask of the audience, how many people have actually heard of Open Daylight? Okay, good. We won't spend too much time on that. So a quick question around, because each of these companies have different approaches to software-defined networking and may have different motivations for joining and participating in Open Daylight. So, one of the things is, and Rob, this is for you, is, and obviously for the other panelists, but what do you think that you can accomplish more so as part of Open Daylight than you could as a standalone company, and where do you get benefits and where does customers get benefits from it?
So something that our company has always said, and I think everyone's kind of followed suit on this, is that the real value in this space is not really in the controller layer. The value is in the applications. And we've had open source products for the last 2 years in the controller space. And what I really see Open Daylight is just an opportunity for everybody to leverage the same really effectively commoditized controller. Everybody's come together and then we'll come back and add the value in the applications. And so if you think of, if you're a startup right now and you're thinking, what is Open Daylight good for? or do I have to create my own controller? And the answer is probably not. Probably you can just grab whatever comes out of Open Daylight and go directly to where you were going to add your value add rather than working on this little infrastructure piece.
Great. Omar, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I think it's one of the things that either slows down or kills nascent technologies is market fragmentation, because generally customers sit on their hands, wait for things to settle. And from a manufacturer perspective, from a customer perspective, there's a lot of not productive effort tied up in supporting multiple browsers or having to support multiple desktops, those kinds of things. So I think the one thing that we know we've done is create a common platform that'll be vendor supported, hopefully community supported. That gives everyone a common playing ground. So like I said a little bit earlier, it reduces risk for both sides. Right now you can focus on building, putting your effort into building things that'll generate value for your customers, which I think is a huge plus for everybody.
So I'll agree with you, Omar. Market fragmentation is something we want to avoid. But I actually want to build on what Rob was saying and take it further. Especially in the data center, it's an ecosystem play. There's so many pieces and no one company, well, there are a few companies that are trying to do all of it, but it's really hard for one company to do the whole thing. And so if you say, how do I get this all together? And everyone's doing their own thing and in a different way, you're not going to get there. And if you say, no, let's start with the controller and let's standardize that controller and now we can build around that, I think you can bring the ecosystem together much better this way.
Yeah, I actually think Big Switch is a great example of building that ecosystem out and building something that then folks can start building value on top of instead of having to keep reinventing the wheel.
The only thing I would say is that in my mind the controller is such a small piece of what I think of as a customer-facing solution that I honestly think that at the end of the day, customers won't care so much about what the controller technology is. They care about what the value add from the application is. And while I'm definitely a very happy and proud member of Daylight, I see this more as a benefit to the vendors so that we all don't have to fight on this common block rather than a value to the customer. Because in the end, I don't think they care about the implementation details of their solution.
Yep.
Excellent. Thanks, gentlemen. So, Kireeti, why don't we start with you on this next one? And I know you told me before you don't like being constrained, but I want to constrain you on this problem, which is, what customer segment, and you can't tell me all of networking again, but what customer segments do you see somebody going, I sorely need an SDN type solution or investment, and you don't see, you or your peers investing in it, but see it as a startup opportunity?
Oh, wow. Okay.
I've got great answers.
So I think the data center is a huge place. There are several things happening in the data center. In fact, you could say the SDN, the pressure of SDN came from the data center because the data center scale is huge and the data center starts with, I have a very agile compute infrastructure. Oh, wait, my you've seen the block, the network is in my way. So I think the data center is a huge place for things. I think storage is another huge thing. I mean, storage is that boat anchor that, I want to do all this stuff, but I've got petabytes of storage sitting here. So I think those two are really big opportunities. Now, how does SDN fit into that? Well, if you actually converge your network infrastructure to do both storage and regular data transfer, storage brings a lot of interesting aspects to this, like completely being lossless, being very low latency, and yet being able to transfer petabytes. Like, how do you do all of that in one? So I think the challenges that storage puts on networking that we haven't begun to scratch the surface on.
Excellent. Now, Rob, you mentioned that you could talk for days on this. I can keep you for a couple minutes, but
so
have at it.
As a startup, you kind of have a high-level decision to make. Do you want to follow the trend, or do you want to go where people aren't going? And so there's a huge opportunity in data center networking, but everybody here is working on that. So
I'm not.
What I hear constantly, and it's a pain to me because I hear customers saying, I really want you to work on DOCSIS and CPE devices for end users, or I really want you to move into campus LAN, or I really want you to move into campus wireless, or there's just a litany of opportunities where, yes, a bunch of us have data center facing things, or I want a better traffic engineering solution in my core. If I was forming a new startup now, I would be looking at some of these further out places where there are fewer incumbents looking right now, because that's really, in my mind, where startups can play.
Excellent.
So two things. I would get funding to go, if I was to play that game, if I were a startup. If I were a startup, I'd go be the Red Hat of software-defined networking. I think there's a huge opportunity for all the other stuff around services support, those kinds of things, and I think Red Hat hit like $1 billion last year, so it's not a bad business model, isn't it? You know? And that's only going to grow. I think the other piece is there's a lot of kind of reinventing the wheel right now. And we're kind of this process of getting a feel for the technology and trying to do things better, differently than what we can already do. I think the real opportunity to build on Rob's point is go where where no one is. The Plexi stuff is awesome. It is really, really cool. Just the geek in me totally appreciates what they've built, and it's something that doesn't exist, and it's something you could never build without SDN. So find those kinds of things, because the things that exist that are unique like that is where you can really build differentiation and value with customers and really drive something other than, hey, here's a cheaper version of something you could buy from a commercial offering.
Thanks, Omar. That actually drives a side question that it's not even in my notes, but you triggered it in me, which is kind of scary that I triggered something live. But so in terms of innovation in SDN and startups, so you mentioned Plexi, and there's a bunch of other folks that are out there that are having combined hardware and software solutions. Mm-hmm. Do you see this as truly a software? Where do you see the line? Should startups be thinking build a whole solution with hardware and software, or should they be focused strictly on software? And where do you see that the line be drawn where they can be successful? Either in either camp is either all software or a combination of hardware and software.
I don't think there should be any constraints. Right? I mean, I think it's build where you can. I think that the software piece certainly is the central piece and the easiest way to differentiate. If you're going to get in the hardware game, certainly there's a much higher barrier to entry. And even if you leverage merchant silicon as an example, right, it's still the same merchant silicon everyone else is using, so it's still dependent on your software or services or something else to build that market differentiation that's going to create value in customers' eyes.
Yep.
If I can quickly add to that, one of the things that's most interesting to me is the difference between hardware and software is getting a little bit fuzzier with things like NPUs, with FPGAs. If you guys haven't seen the Net FPGA project, definitely worth checking out. I think there's a lot of value in that middle ground space, and exactly where startups end up, I think, is really differentiating.
Yep. Well, to add to that, what's interesting is that, you're right about the line being blurred, because if you ship a box with commodity hardware or with an NPU, is that really software or hardware? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think the bigger question is, do you ship software which is amorphous, or do you ship a system, whether it's got software in it or not, right? But it's an appliance or it's a system. And so in all the early SDN talks, you'd see, IBM mainframes here and then PCs on this side. There's something in between that people forget, which is Apple, which basically says, I'm going to control the system. And so IBM mainframes basically said, you buy the whole thing from us. You get everything, including, if you know the word DASD, you're as old as I am. So you get everything from us, and then the PC world says, here's a reference diagram, buy the hardware from anyone, here's the software, let's just put it all together. In the middle, Apple said, and I'm sure there are a whole bunch of people I'm missing, there's Sun, but they said, we'll sell you a system, and it works well, and we control the hardware, we control the software, so we can control the experience. And there's a value for that. There's a value for software, there's a value for a complete solution. And I think it's not an easy choice, but I like the systems.
Yep. Well, and as you were chatting, one other thing that occurred to me was as you start to look at these markets, you mentioned mainframes. Well, I think that IBM's mainframe business is bigger than it's ever been right now, which I think that also means that the legacy and the existing network businesses, well, they may change. They're not going to go away either.
No.
Yep. So my last question, and this is a question that I'd like each of you to address, and Rob, why don't we start with you on this one? And it's a two-part question, which is really, the first one is, what piece of advice do you have for budding entrepreneurs who are in the audience today thinking about what to do? And then secondly is, what is the scar tissue and the lessons that you've learned as an early leader at one of the earliest SDN companies?
So I feel like I'll give one answer that hits both of those, which is, there are two things that you hear as kind of cliched advice for a startup. One is, be focused. Pick one thing, stick. Be very, very, very narrowly focused. And the other is, be nimble. And I will tell you with scar tissue that these things are actually opposites of each other. And that deciding when to stick with plan A or when to go to plan B, that is the hardest part of being a startup, particularly in a very dynamic space like this. And particularly as I joke regularly with the technical counterparts of the gentleman here that we're the mice dancing with the elephants, and so we tend to be very skittish and kind of squeaky. And so pick the ecosystem that you work in carefully, because if it gets very dynamic, your life might get a little bit too interesting.
So I can tell you from my short stint at Contrail that use SDN as part of your pitch and you'll do a lot better. Especially when it comes to raising money.
Can I ask, what did you use in your pitch before SDN?
That's when we didn't get money. Yeah. So, but I mean, to the point about being focused, it is really important. I think the way you navigate that is you pick some big things that you're going to do and not do, and it's as important what you are not going to do. And then within that, you have to course correct. But if you're course correcting the entire ship all the time, you're not going to make forward progress. So for example, in Contrail, the guys who started Contrail were hardware engineers, and they built a switch at Juniper, they built switches at Aruba, and before that in Cisco. They were very much about, hey, we should put this whole thing together, going back to the systems. We made a decision, we are not going to do hardware. We're going to focus on software and build that stack. And then we'll come back maybe in the third round, and talk about hardware. And I think those are the kind of things that you have to make certain decisions, even if your previous experience pulls you in one way. This is my value add. I'm going to go get that part of it done, and then maybe build on that. But so it's hard. As Rob said, it's a dynamic infrastructure, dynamic environment, and you do have to course correct, but you can't go 180 degrees.
Yep.
You can go 360.
Yeah, then you get dizzy.
Yes.
So SDN's a tool. I think my biggest piece of advice is focus on a customer, solve a customer problem. Maybe SDN's the right way to go, and it'll probably make your life easier to get funding right now. Maybe it's not. But I think it's, because there's so much hype, it's very easy to get tied up in the technology. None of your potential customers jumps out of bed in the morning and says, I need an SDN. They're looking for better customer experiences. They're looking for faster call volume, faster handling of call volume or something. Figure out what that is, focus on that piece, and then figure out how you can use some of the stuff that we bring to the table to give you a better mousetrap than the other folks that are out there.
Very sound advice, but I have to contradict one thing. There are people who come to me and say, I want SDN. What is it? So, it does happen.
It's true.
We brought up another. You brought up another interesting point, which was around fundraising and how to take that and does SDN I've heard SDN really means sales-driven network. To your point, which means a barrage of sales guys showing up at your office. And I've even heard SDNs referred to as services-driven network and software-driven network. Silicon. Oh wait, we have that. But I think one of the questions, in all seriousness, around, in advice to our audience today, what is your advice on raising financing? And maybe it's an aggregation of some of the things that we talked about today. But if you're out to go create a pitch, one, we know to have SDN in it. There's one. Two, we know to go after some really cool new stuff that's out there. Maybe it's wireless LANs or LANs. But what other things, from your experience, do you need in order to be able to actually have a pitch that could get funded and give you a chance in the marketplace?
So I'll jump in there. I think that the most important thing is a crystal clear story. So both for the VCs, but more importantly for the customers, because eventually, if the crazy thing happens that you do get money, you'd like to actually turn this into a viable company. And a technology is not a story. So yes, put SDN in the fund in the market slides, but put something else there too.
It's been a while since I've done the VC dance, but I think the other piece is something that's going to give you sustainable advantage. Something that's long term will give you differentiation. If it's a cool idea, but then everyone and their brother can flood into that market, it's going to be not as interesting.
So I'll cop out because I did look at starting my own company, and the VC said, I don't care what your technology is. I don't care, how cool it is or anything. Tell me how you make your first dollar, and tell me what your team is. And these are actually very good questions, right? The problem is I had like nah, I'll just go and join a startup that's already done all the hard work. But I think, having a crystal clear story, not just being about technology. I mean, you might find it, I found it funny initially that the VC is saying, how do you make your first dollar? That's actually really important. Line of sight to how you make your first dollar. And that's more for you and for the VC. For the customer, you have to have a crystal clear story of why they should give you the first dollar. But having that line of sight is what makes startups difficult, or successful startups difficult.
Excellent. Well, thank you, gentlemen. This is the conclusion of our panel today, and everyone, give a hand to the panel, and thank you.